Hello, computers like these started it all by the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. By the time of recording this video, that was about 40 plus years ago. Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, the Amiga, and many more. If you weren't born at that time, then maybe you found some of them in the basement of your parents or grandparents, or maybe you are just fascinated about these old machines. In this video, I'm going to try to help you to get started. I can't cover them all, and my collection, unfortunately, is not that big, so I'm going to start with this one. This is the Commodore 64. It's one of the most popular ones, and it's also the one I used when I was a kid. All these machines shared a lot in common at the time, so even if you don't have a Commodore 64, it doesn't matter. What you're going to learn in this video is going to give you a very good starting point. All these computers were very similar. You have a keyboard like this, and inside you have the CPU, video, audio, and many other integrated circuits for the input and output controllers. But they weren't self-contained like a modern laptop that you have everything that you need to start. They needed to connect to several peripherals. So the first thing that you need is a media storage type that could be tapes, discs, and there were many more. Also, you needed a tape recorder or a floppy drive. One of the cheapest and most common one was to have a tape like this, which were very popular at the time. Everyone knew how to use this to listen to music, so it was a very clever idea to use these ones also to store programs. I still have a box full of all the cassettes that I accumulated during that time that has programs, games, programs that I made, and tons of things that I need to go through them. We're gonna make videos about that. The second most common media type was a floppy disk, like this one. This is a 5 1/4, and this is a 3 1/2. Depending on which one, you will need a particular drive for them. For the cassette, you need something like this, tape recorder, like this Commodore dataset, or this one for the Atari. But for some computers, you didn't have to buy a specific one from their manufacturers. You could use normal tape recorders. Like for example, the Stanley CC R81. As indicated in the manual, they used the input, output, and RAM for remote controllers. So basically they sent and received an audio signal with a program to the computer. Do you wonder how one of these sound like? Yeah, that sound brings back so many memories for me. For the floppy, you need a drive like this one, is the Commodore 1541. Finally, if you want to play games, you need a joystick, something similar to this one that has a joystick connector. Or if you don't have access to one of those, you can also purchase one like this on Amazon. Very similar, and it has a USB connector here that then you can use an adapter to connect to the joystick port. Finally, you want to see some images, right? So for that, you need a CRT TV. Basically, this is like a normal cheap TV set, or you can get a specific monitor or even a PVM, which is called professional video monitors, basically a CRT one. Now, when we talk about video, things get a little bit more complicated because it depends on the quality that you want to have, and also depends on the region you're living and where the device was sold initially. The most common way to connect it was through an RF connector like this one, which stands for radio frequency, which is basically just an antenna you connect to most family TV sets. The quality wasn't great, and you had to deal with the tuning of the TV in the right frequency. Some other computers offer the option to have composite video, and you have a connector like this, which is called RCA connector, and the audio also was separated in their own connector. Now, depending on the region that you lived, there were different analog standards for television, like NTSC, PAL, and SECON. So you have to take that into consideration when you get the computer and the TV set to make sure that they are compatible. If you don't have access to a TV set or a custom CRT monitor, you can also use something like this. These are basically adapters that will take the composite video or the RF signal and convert it into a common modern HDMI digital signal. Now, there is a little problem with this, and it's basically that the signal coming from the computer, that is an analog signal, needs to be converted to the HDMI digital signal. That conversion takes time, and when you're using a program which is mostly static, like editing text or reading something, that is fine. But when you are playing something like a video game, for example, you have latency, and that small delay will give you a very poor experience when playing a video game. And that's all you need to get started. Now, the next thing I really recommend you to do is either download or get also the manual that came with the computer. Most of them came with a manual that was very self-explanatory, because consider that the people at that time had no idea ever access to a home computer before. So these manuals get you really started in every single aspect of the computer, how to turn it on, how to connect it to the cassette, how to load games. Everything that you needed was just here. So I really recommend to get one of these together with the machine that you purchase. And they were basically made for kids. I remember reading this manual here and learning how to program in BASIC for the Commodore 64 and making my first games using this. If you want to tinker and start using them and learn how they worked, I would really recommend to start learning BASIC, which stands for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code. Yeah, BASIC. It was basically a very simple programming language, easy and fast to learn. You can start making simple games. Like, for example, this book here has a lot of examples that kids bought at the time just to start making some games. The only problem with BASIC is that it was slow and take a lot of memory. When I talk about memory, I'm talking about RAM. For example, the Commodore 64 had 64 kilobytes of RAM. That's where the 64 comes from in the name. All the computers, like this one, the Olivetti M10, had only 8 kilobytes of RAM. To get you a little bit into perspective, a modern MacBook Air of 2024 with an M2 processor has the cheapest one, 8 gigabytes of RAM. That is about 100,000 times more RAM than a Commodore 64. 100,000 times. In terms of speed, the Commodore 64 CPU had only 1 megahertz clock speed, and a MacBook Air with an M2 processor has about 3.5 gigahertz. That is about 3,500 times faster. But then you have to put also into consideration that the MacBook Air has several cores. The communication with the memory is faster and the storage is faster. In perspective, that MacBook Air is a monster compared to the Commodore 64. And yet, at that time, people with those limited resources were able to create video games, music programs, accounting programs, text editors, all sorts of things with those super limited resources. Unfortunately, you cannot do that all with BASIC. If you want to get deeper at that level of programming to use all the resources and speed of these computers, you need to learn something like machine language, which is something that many kids and teenagers like me bought books to learn that. And that you could basically make your programs to run way faster, but at the same time forces you to learn more about how a computer works internally. Now, if all of this is not for you and you want to have an experience that is closer to that, but you don't want to put the time and investment in getting the real thing, you can also get something like this. This one looks like a Commodore 64, but it is not a Commodore 64. It's called the 64. And inside you have an emulator. You have USB ports to connect here, an HDMI output. You can connect this to any TV or computer monitor. And it has a real working keyboard. So you have a very similar experience to use a Commodore 64 or a VIC-20, which is also emulated here. Emulators, of course, you add the delay of using the joystick because it is a latency, it's not as fast and immediate response as you will have with a real machine, but for most cases it's good enough. I have a video about this machine, the 64. The link is in the description. Did you know that you can support this channel so I can continue making these videos by becoming a patron? With a very small contribution, you can have access to early release videos and also to behind the scenes content. Check the link below. Thank you. If you want to learn how to program the Commodore 64, I have some videos. I'm planning to make more of them. The link is below in the description. Now that you're here, I think you would enjoy this video where I restore this old joystick back to its original glory. Thank you for watching. See you next time.